Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm Chance Coble. Welcome to this next session of an Ask Me Anything, this one on multi-tenancy. I've been a Yellowfin partner for the better part of 15 years, focusing most of my work with Yellowfin and doing implementations for software vendors and other organizations that are looking to integrate Yellowfin into a product or do some kind of third-party presentation, possibly a revenue-generating product for customers. In Ask Me Anything, this format, if you've never been to one of these before, these are kind of a special webinar where we introduce a topic. In this case, we'll introduce multi-tenancy in Yellowfin, and I'll go through some concepts in the topic a little bit, do a little bit of tutorial, and just kind of introduce it so that you sort of see how it works and what some of the basic fundamentals are and how you use it in Yellowfin, and then we'll open it up for the majority of the session for questions. In that, just type in your questions in the appropriate place and answer the first one. Yes, this is being recorded. So multi-tenancy, let's just kind of start on a very general terms. This is where you are taking one single piece of software and you are publishing it out to multiple audiences in groups of either organization or other type of sort of compartmentalized views of the world. And this has become a much more common approach to publishing software, especially as the SaaS market has grown so much. Here you're using a single piece of infrastructure to create your application, and then you're using that one published modality in order to put content in front of a number of different audiences, possibly with different concerns. In each case, what you're gaining from this is that when you put that single application in front of multiple audiences like that, back in the day when we did that and you had to publish it either on-prem or do a separate application for each audience, the cost of what you were doing grew with each individual organization that you needed to publish to. And typically you had to copy code and customize or put sort of these publish into appliance and customize and configure for each individual organization. What the world has grown into, especially in the last, say, couple of decades, is putting these into a single shared environment that is multi-tenant, and our term for that in Yellowfin when we get in is client organization, but it's a multi-tenant environment that publishes to all audiences in one single piece of software. Typically, the people who are going to be interested in a webinar like this come from two different, let's just say, camps. One of which is you've got software or an application or you're thinking about publishing, and this is the first time you've really come across how do you build from the ground up a multi-tenant experience so that your costs don't grow with your number of clients. In other words, every time you add a client, you're not also adding configuration and customization costs. So that's where multi-tenancy kind of comes in from the department head or business stakeholder. The other camp that tends to be interested in this are a group of, let's say, application development leaders or others who are looking at it more from a technical aspect, where maybe you have a Yellowfin deployment already, or you're thinking about having Yellowfin deployment, and you're really looking for some details on how to integrate something like Yellowfin into that environment and into your application so that you wind up getting that multi-tenant set of features and kind of minimizing your workload in the process of that integration. So in this, I'm going to try to touch on the interests of both camps. And I'll start here, as I'm saying, about this shared environment. The needs you're really trying to meet there are that you're trying to publish for as much of your audience as possible, really publish for everybody, but only do that work one time. So we're going to look at some ways of content user management so that you're really only publishing that work that you do in terms of a dashboard or report development or any kind of analytics you design one time, but it will meet the interests of all sorts of different concerns, customized in a way that each of those concerns is really seeing their own view of the world. Content management, in addition to user management, content being your reports, your dashboards, other types of analytics that you publish. If you're putting that content out there, being able to manage it so that you can do things like allow for self-service customization, or compartmentalize it so only a certain number of people are able to see, or certain maybe subgroups within each tenant are able to see certain content, being able to manage that at scale. Because with multi-tenancy, what you really want to accomplish is, if you've put 2 clients on, you want that really to be the same amount of work as putting about 1,000 on, as much as you can possibly make it that way. The key thing here is you want to make sure that those costs of new clients are completely decoupled and fixed from the value you're able to generate by scaling out to all of those tenants. Data separation is a big one we'll talk about today. And so in data separation, what you're really doing is, in addition to providing the compartmentalized content, so maybe different reports and dashboards, although in some cases you're publishing one report to all audiences, the data separation allows you to set it up so that those views that you're publishing out to all of those audiences are on their own data. So each time somebody logs into Yellowfin from their organization, they're only seeing their data and the reports and dashboards that they would have access to. And then finally, we're going to spend a little bit of time on styling. And so we'll talk about how to set up branding and a custom look and feel, even published out to each tenant with a minimal amount of configuration. And I think these are the key points that cover really what we get out of multi-tenancy if we do it right. Okay, so let's talk about some of the benefits just in terms of user and content management. So the first piece of this benefit is the out-of-the-box content. When one of these organizations first logs in and they get a look at your dashboard, your analytics, you have probably already published a set of content for them that is really meant for everybody, but they're seeing with their own data. And so when they're seeing the reports and dashboards with their own data, it looks like it was built just for them. But the fact is, you built it once and then you're sharing it out to everybody. However, now you want to be able to, say, give them customization capabilities on that content so they can edit it. But editing reports that you're publishing for everybody, obviously that doesn't work. So being able to manage both out-of-the-box content and how they set up customization is key in giving everybody their own world to live in and interact with, while at the same time providing tested and secured content that you've published and verified for all of your audiences. And then that user administration piece, being able to set it up so that if you have, again, 2 tenants with 10 users each, or 1,000 tenants with 10,000 users each, either of those scales should work just fine if you have a good kind of fundamental multi-tenancy setup. So what I'm going to do here is I'll pull up Yellowfin and I'll talk about some of these concepts I've just gone over in that slide, in user administration and content separation. So let me just pop over into Yellowfin really quick. Yeah, and if I did that right, you should be seeing a Yellowfin dashboard now. So here we're just logged into, I call it vanilla Yellowfin dashboard. It's styled as vanilla. We're seeing kind of out-of-the-box content, as we'll demonstrate today. Really, this is demonstration content that you can install. If you've ever installed Yellowfin and it asks you to check that box for tutorial content, this is that content. It is a fictitious company that sells athletic equipment to ski teams around the world. And we'll start out with just how you get going with multi-tenancy. So the term, again, we're going to use here is client organization. And when we come into our administration console and press that configuration link that I just pressed, we then go to the lock. So it's administration, console, configuration, go to the lock, and then you see client organization is one of the options here, and I've turned it on here. This will be off when you first install Yellowfin. So go ahead and turn it on and then save it. And once you turn it on and save it, you're going to get another menu down here on the lower right that gives you the option to configure your client organizations. So now the default is your root. And I'm going to illustrate this in a moment on another slide, but if you can kind of think of it as a two-level hierarchy where you are logged into the default tenant, and this is the root hierarchy. This has special privileges. It is, in fact, the only tenant that can share content, dashboards, reports, and so on, to other tenants. All other tenants, if they develop content within their tenancy, are going to be locked within that tenant. The default organization, however, this is where we can develop content and we can publish it as out-of-the-box content for each tenant that they wind up seeing their own compartmentalized view of the world. So I'm just going to pop into one of these really quick. We can add new tenants here. And when we do, go ahead and give them a friendly name. And then we have this user management down here. Now, of course, you immediately might go, okay, well, if I have to go in and set up each one of these tenants, and then I go into this menu and I wind up adding by searching for each person that I'm going to add in this case, then that seems onerous if I've got 10,000 tenants and thousands of users in each one. Well, in that case, you would probably want to use the Yellowfin API. Everything I'm going to show you how to do here, you can use the API in Yellowfin to do. And that's where you're setting up, for the less technically inclined, programmatic hooks in whatever technology infrastructure you're using to manage your tenants in general. You set those hooks up in there so that they call on Yellowfin in the back end and wind up doing through automation all of the actions we're going to do through the UI today. And so when we have clients who need to set up for large scale tenants and really anything beyond 20 or 30 tenants, is going to start to get onerous to manage in an interface like this. So you wind up using that API just to set up those hooks, and then everything is managed and automated along with your existing enterprise systems. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about just content folders to make sure everybody's familiar with that, because it'll be an important aspect of setting up our little multi-tenant example here. So in these content folders in my system, I've got several top-level folders. If you're not familiar with these folders, you basically set up and add top-level folders. They're two-level, top-level, and then subfolders within each one of those top-level folders you've created. And I've got an examples folder here. You give it a name, and then there's user access with making it unsecure so anybody can get to it, public where you can set the security levels for users, or private where you have to actually explicitly grant user access into those folders. So let's just say we have one that we have to that is public, but we're going to give it maybe limited access to groups or whatnot. First step I always recommend when you install Yellowfin is to go ahead and create a draft folder. And the reason we'll be doing that, especially if you have a multi-tenant deployment, this gets important, is that there's usually a lot of tape left on the editing room floor when we start working with the Yellowfin instance. We create reports, we decide we don't like them, we do that a few times, and then we publish one. And those few reports that we created are left in quote-unquote draft mode. Well, those will be by default stored in your draft content folder that you mark with this checkbox. So I recommend you do that as soon as you install Yellowfin, and go ahead and do it for each of your tenants as well. But for the content that we have stored in here now, if we want, when we create that content, we can go ahead, and I just showed you a couple of other users we have in tenants. I'm going to log out of the default tenant. If you're doing this management through the interface, you'll probably be logging out and logging in a bunch, so it's good to have a login handy when you're ready to go. And I've got my set of ski zone employees, which is one of the tenants that I was just showing you, who all happen to be named after well-known mathematicians. So now we're logged into the ski zone tenant, and I'm still seeing that same content. Now, the key thing I just wanted to show you about that customization and out-of-the-box content is that if I wanted to edit this, I've lost my privileges for editing. You would normally go over here into report, and if you had privileges for editing, you would be able to do it right here. And the user I was just logged in as before in the default tenant could do that. But because this is published from the default tenant, because it's in that folder with privileges, I can't actually edit and save within that folder. However, in this tenant, I have created a set of folders so users within this tenant can also edit reports. So in order to do that, in this case, I have to copy the report And then when I do, I will save it into my own folder. And maybe I'm just trying to edit this to make it a circle here a bit larger, or whatever I'm trying to do. But the key is I can go in and customize this report. A couple of points to make about that, though, is that once I go in and customize a report and I save it in my own custom folder, which this folder subfolder is within this ski zone tenant, right? This is specific to the tenant that I'm logged into. Once I save it in here, it is mine. I have now customized it and I own it, and I can continue to edit this content. Again, you can only do this if you've been granted privileges to do it. We'll look at another user in a minute who doesn't have privileges to edit reports, but when you do this, you own it. Why is that important? Well, when you publish that out of the box content and then you go back and your organization, your default publishing organization, you're pushing out all these analytics to these different companies. When you push a new version of that report or dashboard out, you will, at that point, update the report that was the original report. You will not update the customized copy that they copied into their own folder. They now own this because they've customized it, and it'll be up to them to keep up with those updates. So if they want to do that customization again with the newly updated report, then they'll have to go back and copy it again. The benefit of that is that now you have a pristine copy of all the reports you're publishing to those customers, but you have a process for allowing them to customize it whenever they need to. Okay. We can go back to our root tenant again. We'll be logging in and logging out a lot today. By the way, if you set a user up in that interface that I was just showing you, and you have multiple tenants that user is associated with, it'll just prompt you like this at the beginning to ask what tenant you want to log into. All right, back to our slideshow. There we go. Data separation. Let's talk about this. I think this is kind of everybody's sort of bread and butter expectation of multi-tenancy. When we start out, we kind of get into some of those things like user management, dashboard separation, and being able to customize and publish out of the box content. But this data separation thing is really what we think of, because a lot of times when we think of multi-tenant SaaS apps, we think of those really common applications that are consumer facing, things like you log into your bank and everybody sees their own account in their bank. And it would be a major violation if anybody ever saw anybody else's information, or if information was in any way leaked to an outside party beyond just another tenant. So this is very serious stuff that has to be very deeply designed into the solution that you want to get and integrate with. And so you're trying to compartmentalize access. The default organization, in the case of Yellowfin, winds up being able to set up these access filters for each tenant, and then you can set up access filters for any other property of a user within a tenant if you want. So if you have multi-layer filters you need to put in place, you can do that and highly customize exactly how each group within these tenants are customized. But today we're just going to focus on the tenant filter itself. We're going to compartmentalize access so it's filtered across. And in Yellowfin, or really in any solution you're trying to use for multi-tenancy, you want to be able to govern that solution. You want to be able to go back and take a look at who has access to what and be able to report on that. And so let's take a look at just this graphic really quick. This graphic came, by the way, from a case study that Yellowfin did with data growers, but it's a general example of how each of these is published. So you have the default organization where we're developing all our out-of-the-box content. We set up these filters, and then from there, each one has a filter that's applied, so they're only seeing their view in the table. Now, we're also going to show a slightly less common but very important example of a use case where each of these databases might be a different database. And this comes up every once in a while where people say, I don't have a single large multi-tenant database. I have a set of databases, one for each organization, and I need to be able to change which organization is being pointed at every time somebody goes and looks at a report. That's a technique called sort substitution, and we're going to quickly talk about that as well. Okay, so very quickly, just going back to our client organization configuration screen here. You'll notice for each of these client organizations, we have not only the set of users that are associated with that client organization, but each one also has this client reference ID. That becomes a value that we can then turn around and put into the metadata in Yellowfin called a view. So if you've never edited a view before, this is what it looks like. We're going to edit one here that's specific to these tenant filters. And it is essentially the way Yellowfin builds a model of what your data looks like so it can interrogate that data, do data discovery, and then run reports eventually on it. So when we start out going in to edit this, it's first going to take us to the schema view where we're looking at the actual database tables. Next, we're going to take a look at what the join relationship we've put together in those tables is. And specifically for this multi-tenancy concern, we're going to go into one of those columns. We'll look at the formatting and access. And in that access, by default, we would have no access filter selected. But in Yellowfin, in this case, we have selected the client reference ID, which would be the name of the company. In this case, I've just made that the client reference ID for the clients I've created. So one of them will be, for example, Ski Zone, that tenant we were just looking at. So once that client reference ID is set, then we have that filtering applied on each of these, on each of the queries that we're going to run from reports that look through that data source. And so, for example, go ahead and edit this report. When you create a report on this, you'll notice that this is selected as an access filter. I'm an admin, so I have access to manipulate that. And then each company is filtered out, and we're only looking at the default tenant, which, if you recall, the client reference ID for that default tenant is Go Wandering. The next one we'll look at is Ski Zone. And then once we come through to the actual design of this report, if we want, if you're a little more technically inclined, you can look at what Yellowfin's doing under the hood. You can see it's just applying a filter on our behalf. This is very deeply designed into Yellowfin, so every time it constructs each of those queries to interrogate that data, it's just putting that filter in there for us to make sure that the user is only seeing what they can see. This is not an editable query, by the way. All right, so when we save this report and I log out of here and I go back and I log in as Weidman's, our Ski Zone, let's go take a look at our reports. Got marked as a favorite in my tenant here. Go. And now we're looking and we see another filter has been applied for Ski Zone. So rather than Go Wandering, we're seeing the Ski Zone data. So this just shows you that as you go into these different tenants, you wind up compartmentalizing it just based on that access filter from setting up those client reference IDs and then setting up the reports that use them. So from there, very quickly, I'm going to show you before I go back into the root tenant, and we'll talk about source substitution. If we are in our tenant, I've also created another data source called Ski Zone Data Source. This is an example of what a data source might look like if each of your tenants had their own database that you wanted to point to. So they could build reports on it if you wanted to do a self-service option. In addition to that, you'll need this for out-of-the-box content, which let's go back and log into our root tenant. And we go back to our admin screen. And let's just pick on any data source here. And when we go down to our usage parameters, down here is where we can set up our source substitutions. So we're in the default tenant, and if any time this data source is selected and someone's logged into a different tenant, I can set for each one of these tenants which of those tenant data sources should be selected here. Again, this is the user interface way of doing it. Obviously, if you had a lot of tenants and you needed to manage that or manage updates on it, you would do this through the API. if you set that up, what'll then happen is that each of those reports that's built on views that are pointing to that data source, the data source will be substituted whenever a tenant logs in, and you'll wind up getting data from that database rather than from the original. So there are two ways we've talked about here. One is source filters, which will apply a filter to the query for one large database that has all of your tenant data in it. And the other way is source substitution, where you're substituting in databases because you have a different tenant in every database. Okay. And we did that. And finally, just very quickly talking about styling, but I think it's very important. I'm personally not a graphics artist. I don't have a good styling bone in my body, but I happen to think it's very important work and very important to get it right. And I love that Yellowfin allows it to just be a configuration option in most cases. And then if ever you need to bring an expert in, you can get in to create that seamless branding and that look and feel. That's been a big benefit in the past, specifically because even though we talk a lot about governance and security with multi-tenancy, because those are very important concepts, making people feel like this was designed just for their organization, or they're seeing the kind of brand alignment that they're expecting to see, rather than seeing any other outside vendors, sometimes even a powered by Yellowfin language is something that would have to be considered very carefully before you do it, and it's not required when you publish these Yellowfin applications out to third parties or to client organizations. So, so for this to be able to set up that seamless branding, to get that kind of look and feel, that helps each individual viewing their own compartment of the world feel kind of comfortable that they're actually viewing something that was really designed for them. So how do we do that in a way that's very efficient when we're scaling out to a large number of organizations? Let's just go through a little example of that really quick. There we go. Okay, so once again, back to our client organization screen. Now, we can manage each of these on number of users, their client reference IDs. I'm going to add a third element to this, which is a custom uh, uh, styling folder. So in addition to being able to go into each of these tenants and configure Yellowfin so that it is styled with certain fonts or colors, and those are applied as well to any report or dashboards you develop. If we wanted to really get intense about this and put actual style sheets in place with some web elements, we have a web developer that's ready to do that, we can put those directly into the Yellowfin server, and it will start restyling Yellowfin in any way that we want. Now, to show this, if it gets to the to the extreme here, this is a separate application. This is not Yellowfin, but because it integrates through the single sign-on mechanism with Yellowfin, it goes over to Yellowfin without any other authentication being required. It's securely signed into Yellowfin in the background, and this is actually Yellowfin that you're looking at. So Yellowfin by default looks like this, but when you restyle it and you make it completely integrated with another application, you can do this in such a way that it winds up looking like any application pretty much that you want. This brand is completely aligned with the demonstration application in this case, but it shows just how far you can take this if you really want to make Yellowfin look like another application entirely. So here, we're just going to change a couple of colors. We'll save this, so now we have a ski zone custom CSS folder. And of course, we'll log out, and then we'll log back in. This time we'll log in as Carl Gauss. And you see we've got a little bit of a different styling here now, kind of a bit more aligned with the brand we're about to create. And so going further into, let's actually go in as an admin here real quick. Here's password straight, there we go. In here as an admin, we see the custom styling, and we will go in and apply our own logo. Now, when you are in a Yellowfin tenant, again, you can do this with the API or directly in the database, actually. If you wanted to set it up so you have your own custom page header, there's a custom CSS folder for all of your CSS stylings or web elements like that, a custom images folder where you can put any images in there will actually supplant images that come from Yellowfin. So you can replace all of the images and graphics artifacts from Yellowfin in that way. You can also completely replace the headers and footers. And in this case, I'm just going to put a custom header example that I created. So we see now the Ski Zone brand along with our name here, and this name is pulled to the Yellowfin API. So now when we come back to the dashboard, we're actually looking at something with our own logo on it, styled with our own colors, and this can be taken further and further until it really looks like your own application if you really take it that far. And the Yellowfin colors and branding have entirely been removed. Okay, now I'll just kind of wrap up with a little bit of a sort of risks and challenges point that I like to make. I first came across really multi-tenancy applications this is before I actually started doing work with Yellowfin, and in this case, it was with a company that was doing analytics for large-scale retailers, for enterprise retailers in the West Coast, and I remember there was a central vendor in there trying to sell them essentially appliances to do all their data crunching on-prem appliances, systems that they could install in their own, premise or co-location facility, and very much benefiting from the need to potentially scale from one server instance out to, as many as they had clients. And, the guy was just saying, like, I can't believe you're even thinking about having Target and Walmart's data together on the same disk platter. They'll never buy your product. And that really is proven not to be true. However, in order to address those concerns, which still exist today, we need to have some manner for mature data separation and robust security and governance, and to really be able to have a good story around that. With Yellowfin, you're dealing with a product that's pretty tried and true. I mean, it's celebrating its 20th year, done this for thousands and thousands of end users, tens of thousands of end users. And when it publishes that, you can also go in and use its auditing functionality in order to see what queries it's running on for what user, on behalf of what user. And so there's a lot of maturity there. In addition, just kind of with someone who gets pulled into some of these custom application development projects from time to time, you see a lot of times people consider and compare this against building it themselves. And there are real challenges around building it yourself when you have to do something from the ground up, and you run the risk that any developer out there is going to wind up publicly exposing something as a web variable on a page that if some hacker knows how to do it, they can literally just change elements on the code and the page that they've downloaded to their browser, submit that to the server, and they can do things like change the tenant that they're logged into. It's very scary stuff, and it really doesn't take that big of a mistake on the part of a developer in order to do that. Using a product that has this built in from the start and separates everything and has successfully done that for quite some time now, really gives me a much bigger comfort level with putting that in front of critical audiences, especially enterprises or say, companies that have to meet certain compliance regimes. There is a performance concern. Obviously, anytime you're doing multi-tenancy, the good news is that performance concern mostly is passed through to the database. Since Yellowfin does live queries directly to the underlying database, that is really where you have to set up your performance. Most databases are set up for that kind of concurrent activity. However, you are moving in many cases, many different organizations, if you do that at the database level, to one large multi-tenant database, and you should just account for that in your system design. And then for systemic customization, obviously, clients, I heard somebody describe them as, sometimes they're like goldfish where they're just constantly, at the top of the water looking for another dab of food. Obviously, you can customize infinitely, for clients, and they'll still ask for more in some cases. And so somewhere or another, you kind of have to draw the line. The key thing with multi-tenancy is get as much bang for your buck as you can that's been designed into that so that you can do that customization on styling, on data separation, and on content, and then allowing them to self-serve as much as possible. And that's really how you separate those concerns from growth in the number of clients that you're trying to serve, and the growth and what it costs to serve them. If you can separate those two so the growth and the cost stays fixed while you can grow to as many clients as you want, then you've really achieved what you're looking for. So with that, as usual, I'm a little long-winded, but I think we still have plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to start looking over here in the questions section. Please feel free to post questions. Some questions here, not in English. There we go. Yes. So let's see. Sebastian, go ahead. All right, a sales team of 3 people. And you would like to show the dashboard segmented for each salesperson in this case. In this case, obviously, yeah, that's a good question because client reference isn't really quite what you're after because that's more for organizational filtering. But let's take a look at that really quick because there is a way to address exactly that, and it comes from that composition of filters that that I was referring to. So let's look at a little example of that really quick. And then I'll show you how to, there's another question about actual avatars and images for each salesperson. All right, so let me just learn to type chance. Okay, there we go. Logging in. Okay, so first of all, let's just talk about compartmentalizing and separating data for individuals within an organization, and I think that'll help just kind of add a little bit to context in terms of being able to filter for organizations, but then also being able to filter for additional layers of groups within organizations, including your default one. So let's just go on and mess around with this tenant filters one. And I'll show you how to do this. I'll explain it, and then I'll certainly leave some things here for the motivated reader. Okay, so in our access where we looked at this client reference ID, if we did not want to use a client reference ID, or maybe another field was a client reference ID, but we want to say you've got the email address of your salesperson, Sebastian, so you have so you wind up having that that user available there. You can actually, in addition to creating a client reference ID, you can create an access filter that's more generic. And when you do that, you have 4 options here where you create it from an existing report, manual, through a CSV. Those 3 I've really never seen done in practice. Almost always it's a SQL query against an underlying database. And when you create that SQL query, I'll go back from here and I'll set it up manually, but you would just type that SQL query in here that you want to go against a data source that you select. And if you want to know what that SQL query has to produce, you just click on View Sample Output, and it'll show you exactly what that SQL query needs to output in order to yield the client filter. And so each of these values is, what are you filtering on? Most of the time, people filter on email or user ID. That is the user that's logged into Yellowfin. The type of reference it is, you can have as many client reference IDs, as many access filters as you want. And so each of those has a named type, and then the actual ID for that. And so here you have gender, and you have 2 values here. You have country, ISO. You would have, maybe you could have as many as a couple hundred options in that. And so what you're doing here is you're applying, based on the user that's logged in, a filter for that user to be applied to the field that you're working on right now. So you go through and finish that setup, and it queries the database regularly to get that value. And then once you do that, just like with a client reference ID, you could select your own access filter, and it would be applied to that field for the user. Then, regarding setting up separate images for them, you can set the custom image up in the same way that I set that custom header up here. You could set up something, along the lines here of what they have. You can set that image up actually in a report based on data that's coming back from the database. So you set the URL of the image basically is what comes back, and then you tell Yellowfin that column is a URL type. Or if you're looking for something more collaborative, everybody has profile settings, where in here in the profile, you can actually set your image as your own avatar if you want. And so each of your salespeople can actually do that for themselves. All right, good question. Just scrolling through here. Oh, so when there are multiple tables joined, there actually are in this case. Let's go back and take a look at that really quick. This is for Rajesh. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. You go in and edit this model here. There are multiple tables joined here. And so they're just joined in such a way that once you lock in the company name, and I actually forget which table here it comes from, but is it our main fact table, or is there a dimension? Um, well, I guess I don't need to look all around for it. Um, so each one of these tables that gets joined together, you really only have to filter on one of those in order to have the join relationships match the data that you're looking for. So Yellowfin does very well with these uh, star style schemas. I can obviously work with a lot of other database designs. Any way you can represent as a SQL query, really. Um, but yeah, so if you wind up joining these together, you're going to want to join them together in such a way that if you filter a table, you'll wind up getting the matching data across the relationships on all the joins. Hope that answers your question. Um, and then of course you can apply the client reference ID or the access filters. Just kind of going through here. Oh, interesting. So I'm just going to read this question out because it's a good one. As the reports and dashboards are created in the default view, I assume we mean the default tenant, is it recommended to create client user groups at the default tenant instead of the client level? We have a use case of different business units. So we want to have customers of a business unit not see dashboards from another business unit. The truth is you can do that either way. I can see two scenarios. One is you set up your business units as uh, different folders to compartmentalize the access to dashboards that each of the others shouldn't see. And so you maybe have like content packs that go into each one of those folders, and users can have different levels of access to each one. Access levels in each of those folders are read. You can be denied access entirely. You could have read access to it. You can have edit access, which gives you read access, or you can have delete access, which gives you both edit and read access. And so you can have users be able to see content in those folders at any one of those access levels. And then, in addition, you could set up an access filter that's a generic access filter, not a client-based one. And you would do all that without setting up multi-tenancy in the way that I showed you the client organizations here. Your kind of multi-tenancy setup would be basically those folders and the access filters. And if you don't have to do any other styling, or you don't have to mess with any other kind of organizational constructs, then that could work very well for you. If you do, then setting up client organizations, I would definitely go ahead and set up the users for each business unit in the organization that they're going to be in. And that way, the key thing that's really going to change there and constrain those users is with one of those business units develops content and saves it, it's going to be they're never going to be able to share that content with another business unit if you set it up that way as an actual client organization function, as a multi-tenant, truly Yellowfin multi-tenant function. So if it's ever possible that they're going to want to share content from one business unit to another that they've developed, then I would say go ahead and do it all in one, quote unquote tenant, but make your multi-tenant solution for those business units all at the default level. Because really Yellowfin multi-tenancy from the ground up is set up so that only the default tenant can ever share content with the tenant organizations. So that's one consideration I would really use when you set up that design. You certainly can. I think from what you described here, just knowing 2 or 3 sentences about what you're doing, you certainly can set all that up in one tenant and set it up so your folders and an access filter are restricting each one of those from the data they can see as well as the content they can see. And you may not even need, I guess, an access filter if you're really just showing different report data and reports and dashboards to each of those different business units. That's a good question. Okay, so here's one is how do you handle ad hoc reporting? Because now you're getting into a situation where if they're creating their own reports from scratch, you don't want them to be creating views, obviously, in your database because there are too many sort of there's too much potential for a security breach in them accessing the data in any way that would allow them to set up joins and tables or anything like that. But at the same time, you want them to be able to develop reports and do their own data discovery. There are a couple of ways. One is if you just want to do straight up ad hoc reporting out of the Yellowfin interface, in the same way that I had that ability to edit a report that already existed, I could have created a new report on an existing view, but not have access to see or edit the view. So that means I can actually just open up the report editor on that view and create my own report, and I'm off to go. But if you want to do something even simpler, it's possible to publish a view that then you're allowing them access to that natural language query interface. And that natural language query interface allows you to do something even more kind of high level and even more, I would say, ad hoc and faster by just giving them the ability to go in and say, ask a question in the tenant, and they would select what it is they want to do. And then from there, you would have some kind of, tenant filtering directly on the view, which would then be applied to any question that they asked. So if they wanted up coming in here and saying, I just want to compare something, and I want to compare it, let's just say, compare a value between, say, like a year over year for 2 different date ranges, and then ask that, then you've got an ad hoc kind of question here. And then if they wanted to, they could even, if they had the authority to edit reports, they could even go as far as opening it up in the report editor and then making their edits or whatever. But they're not starting with zero. They're doing something that's quite simple. And I find I bring this up specifically because a couple of reasons. One, it tends to lower your support burden with your tenants if they can do something where they do very simple data discovery. it supports them in that case when they're in a meeting on Tuesday afternoon and they have to answer a question that they don't already have a report that will answer for them. But also, it allows you to publish something that gives them a way to develop questions and interrogate the data, even if they're not particularly data literate as an organization. And so they can get into something that's just very simple for them to ask questions. So that's basically how I would address that. You can still publish that view to the tenants without them being able to get into it and edit it. So your security would be covered in that case. And then you also have the ability to allow them to access that view if you set it up through that natural language query. So that's all they really see. Sure. I think you can actually get my contact info. So there's a question about whether or not people are able to contact us or me after the session. Certainly, if you reach out to Yellowfin, they'll get back to you, and I'm sure contact info is all over the literature for the webinar. And then also, if you want to speak with me specifically, feel free to say, hey, I'm looking to set up some time with Chance to talk to them about any of this stuff, and they'll share my contact info with you. Sure, that's fine. Oh, yes. I think maybe when I was talking through user management in the tenants, I just kind of glossed over the fact that if you're setting up in that default tenant users that have access to different tenants, you can set those users up as administrators so they have access to add other users within their tenant, and they can essentially self-serve on that administrative function. So if I'm logging out of Yellowfin here, and then I wind up logging in as the administrator that I set up, and I go into these administrative functions. I'm actually an admin in this tenant now. I have given myself probably a lot more authority than I would give a tenant admin in real life. But the fact is, I can go in and I can add users into this tenant, and this has only users that are available in this tenant. And then as I add new users here, I wind up getting the those new users in the tenant. And if I log in my own ID in the default tenant, again, I will see that those users have been added to the tenant. Notice that even though I have full administrative access and functionality, I don't have the client organization editing over here, because that would obviously be a breach, since we don't want tenants editing anything about the client organization configuration. So that's still lacking over here. But other than that, you can add users, you can add data sources if you give people the functionality to do that. And they can even manipulate roles within their tenant. And if you've never gotten into Yellowfin roles before, start out with a default tenant, but you can actually edit in roles, pretty granular access to the different areas of Yellowfin. But the access to each of the tenants, the ability to set up things like custom headers, even customize the email template and content styling, all that kind of stuff, that can be done through an administrator directly in the tenant. So you can actually educate and adorn your tenant admins with a lot of responsibility if you're open to doing that, and it would help you out. What are the options to limit the number of allowed custom reports or NLQ reports to avoid poor performance and overloading of the configuration database? When you set up a content folder, it's an interesting question. I've actually seen someone who needs to use this for quite that reason. But when you set up one of those content folders, you can set it up to be restricted on size. And so you can set up the size of the content folder to be restricted on, say, versions, number of reports, size of data, anything like that that you want to constrain it on so that when people go in and start developing reports in there, they'd be limited somehow on the amount of content they could put in. And then I'm not sure about constraining the number of NLQ queries. I haven't actually seen that question or a way to approach that before, but you can constrain the number of fields that are available in NLQ. So you can certainly make it so that it is all saved to a draft folder. They're deleted in time if they're not saved as reports or published, and then you can make it so that the fields that are available in NLQ are constrained, so you're not doing anything too complex or unwieldy. All right, and it looks like we've gotten through it. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Everybody, thanks a bunch for attending. I always enjoy giving these and hearing your questions. So please have a good Wednesday, and we'll see you at the next Ask Me Anything.